For my migration interview, I had a conversation with Dr. Lindsay Aegerter of Lakeside High School about her immigration from Zimbabwe to the US. Dr. Lindsay Aegerter was born in Zimbabwe, where she received her undergraduate degree from the University of Zimbabwe. After her graduation, she went to work for a year in London. Beforehand, she had applied for a graduate scholarship to do her master's degree anywhere in the world. She didn't get it and intended to move back to Zimbabwe after her year in London, but in 1985, she was notified that the winner of the scholarship had not accepted and that she was the alternate candidate. That year, Dr. Aegerter applied and was accepted to San Diego State University. 6 months into her degree, it was in California where she met and decided to marry her husband, an American. After completing her master's degree and traveling for a year, it was then that she immigrated to the US. Her and her husband, Gil, first lived in Wilmington, North Carolina, and eventually settled in Seattle, as her husband needed to be in a metropolitan city for his news editor job, and it was relatively close to Alaska, which is where his family resided. Although it was a collective decision between her and her husband to move to the US, in the interview, she described herself as an accidental American.
I never chose to come to the United States permanently. When my husband, he proposed, I knew I wanted to marry him, but I had a lot of questions about actually leaving my country permanently.
One thing she made clear is that there were few factors pushing her away from Zimbabwe, her home location, and she still bears a deep connection to the country. Instead, it was the positive factors of the US and her desire to marry her husband which ultimately pulled her to the States. This is different from many immigrants throughout history and today, as many come to the US not only seeking the opportunity that lies in the country, but fleeing factors such as violence and political turmoil. Examples of this are the many Chinese immigrants that came to the US in the mid-1800s, who fled China due to the Opium Wars beginning in 1849, and the Taiping Rebellion, which overlapped starting in 1850. Or many of the immigrants during the Great Migration from 1916 to 1970, who fled the South for northern cities due to poor economic conditions and the oppression of Jim Crow. When asked about the difficulties of her immigration and assimilation to US culture, Aegerter noted the most hardship in relation to the legal system of obtaining her green card, which she used until 2007 when she became a US citizen in order to vote for Barack Obama in the 2008 election. Having a decent background, a husband in the States, and being white and English speaking, she explained that becoming a resident alien and getting her green card was much more challenging than expected.
I wasn't made to feel particularly welcome. The whole bureaucracy was really difficult, and honestly they lost my application for a long period of time. I kept waiting, and eventually I went back, and they literally found my application sort of on a shelf somewhere arbitrarily, and the person who eventually processed my application was not very kind or welcoming.
Although it has been much more difficult throughout history, such as 30 years prior to her immigration, when quotas restricted the number of immigrants allowed from each country, Aegerter's experience of obtaining legal residency and citizenship in the United States was the same as countless other immigrants. She did mention, however, that her privilege of having a husband in the States helped her greatly in achieving residency, and without this, it would have been near impossible.
I actually said to him, I am legal, and I'm English speaking, and I've got all the privileges that a person can have, and it was really hard for me. I can't imagine how hard it is for somebody who doesn't have all my privilege. I can imagine had I tried to immigrate without being married from a country like Zimbabwe, it would have been pretty much impossible.
Yeah.
I would have had to, I think, have a lot of money.
Aegerter's experience of her privileges guiding her through the residency and citizenship process displays the impact of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which guides the current immigration in our country. Although the act abolished restrictive immigration quotas and de facto discrimination against Southern and Eastern Europeans and Asians, it did establish a preference system for letting in immigrants that prioritizes those with nationalized families at the forefront, along with specific skilled workers. In this way, Aegerter's immigration was also similar to many immigrants in that she utilized and was a beneficiary of the prioritization system established by the Immigration and Nationality Act. A prime example of others who utilized the act is many of the Chinese immigrants who, after it was signed in 1965, immigrated to the country on the basis of having family members who were citizens, or those who became doctors and mathematicians in order to become more appealing. Overall, Aegerter made it clear that her assimilation to the US was fairly easy, and that she experienced little to no discrimination being an immigrant in the country. She noted this was mainly due to her husband being an American citizen and her being white.
Because my accent has been a source of privilege, and I've had all sorts of access because of being married to an American, I haven't had nearly the same struggles that people who immigrate under different circumstances from different countries.
In terms of her assimilation to the US and US culture, once immigrating, Aegerter first became an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington in 1992. For this position, she would go to conferences in the US and around the world where she was surrounded by like-minded people, even if they were from different nations.
I had like-minded people, and my specialty is post-colonial and diaspora literature, so that's what my PhD is in, African women's literature. A lot of my colleagues at those conferences were from places like India and Africa, and even if they were American, they shared an interest in international literature. So as a professional person, I was always surrounded by like-minded people.
Aegerter's assimilation is similar to that of many other immigrants in the way that, whether intentionally or not, she surrounded herself through her career with many like-minded people. This follows a pattern that has displayed itself at a much larger scale, such as during the Great Migration in the 20th century, in which a large portion of immigrants assimilated in the North settled in the same neighborhoods and worked in the same businesses. Evidence of this can be seen today in areas in metropolitan cities with dense black populations, such as Harlem, New York. Although she hasn't experienced too much hardship as a consequence of her immigration to the US, Aegerter mentioned several impacts her immigration had on her, one being her international connectivity.
Sometimes I feel like my news world is so myopic and narrow, and I wouldn't really even know about some of the things that consume me here if I would be paying attention, I think, to much more international news. I do feel that American news, of course you get access to some international news, but mostly it's focused on the country, and it is so political.
She also mentioned the influence of the national imperative in the US to be hardworking, and that this has altered her work-life balance.
While that is admirable, and I am an extremely hardworking person, I feel like the whole concept of work-life balance is sometimes lost in this culture, and especially at a school like Lakeside.
This last comment concludes one of the main reasons for which people have been drawn to immigrate to the US throughout history, and that is for labor opportunities and opportunity in general. So many have come to the country with the goal of finding profitable work, and this desire has created an atmosphere that greatly values hard work, sometimes to an overwhelming extent, which is what Dr. Aegerter has felt influenced her.